Hello, class. So today we just had our test on the Civil War, and so now we're moving on to our next unit, which is the post-Civil War, which we all call the Reconstruction era. So the when, what, where, and how. After the Civil War ended on May 13, 1865, a plan called Reconstruction took place and it lasted from 1865 to 1877. After the slaves were freed, the South's government needed to be rebuilt to be able to be readmitted back into the Union. So, yes, bridges and roads and buildings were all destroyed during this war, but we're not talking about rebuilding any of those things. We're talking about rebuilding the South's government and their way of thinking. And this took place in all of the southern states that seceded from the Union. The South government had to do whatever it took for forgiveness, which is a key word in this whole process, to be able to rejoin the United States. Who? So there are two very important presidents and two political parties as well that are key in the process of Reconstruction. So the first one is Abraham Lincoln. President Abraham Lincoln was creator of the plan that is formally known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. So this is a formal name for Reconstruction, and he created this plan. And after two major victories, the one in Gettysburg and the one in Vicksburg, in 1863. And so amnesty, which is an official pardon for people who have been convicted for political offenses. So basically, anybody who committed a crime against the country could gain amnesty. And we'll talk about the conditions of that later. And then you had the South, which is the Confederate, versus the North, which is the Union. Now, the South, they did not want the federal government to come in and impede on their states' right. They fought for state rights. They believed that it should be up to them what they do with ex-slaves, what they how they taxed or their constitutions. That's what they believed in. And the North believed in the federal government reigning supreme over states' rights. And also now you had Democrats versus radical Republicans. Your Democrats were for a soft type of reconstructions versus the radical Republicans who wanted harsh punishment for the South seceding away from the Union. Um, and so now we have Andrew Johnson, who was brought to the scene after Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865. He was his vice president. So let's talk a little bit more about President Abraham Lincoln. So after the major victories of the Union at the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Lincoln began to come up with a plan to reunite the North and the South. He wanted a peaceful reunification of the North and South. He didn't want any more fighting going on. He just wanted it to just, come together. Partially because it was more of a political gain. He knew that in order to be reelected, he could not make too many people mad. So he believed the South didn't legally secede from the Union. So based on that, he believed on full forgiveness for the South. So he created the 10% plan, which is basically 10% of the Southern voters had to take an oath of allegiance to the Union to be admitted back into the United States. So everyone was offered a pardon except for high-ranking Confederate officers. So if you were a Confederate officer, you would not offer a pardon. You were probably going to have to pay for some of the war crimes, or if you just kind of kept quiet or kept on the low, you wouldn't be messed with that much. So the key word I would say that Abraham Lincoln um, is associated to is being lenient. Um, he, like I said, he did not want to severely punish the South. He just wanted them to be readmitted and, the country just to be reunited. But his assassination on April 14th stopped his plans, and then now we see we will talk about Andrew Johnson. But before we get to Andrew Johnson, I'm going to talk about a bureau that was created under Lincoln that helped ex-slaves and poor whites as well, which is the Freedmen's Bureau. They provided aid to the newly freed slaves and also poor whites. They provided food for them. They provided hospital clinics. And they also, it was a confiscation act that they passed that was used to collect the land from ex-slave owners and give it to the ex-slaves and the poor whites. And they also provided education. Um, But this bureau ended because of what President Andrew Johnson had did. He sent people to spy on this organization, and they spread falsehood about some of the things that they were doing. So now let's talk about President Andrew Johnson. He was very lenient on the South. Um, he readmitted the Southern states with Lincoln's 10% plan, but he granted full pardons to Southerners and former Confederate officers, which wasn't what the radical Republicans wanted. They did not want that. They wanted harsh, severe punishments. And he believed that it was the states' rights to ratify their own constitutions and what to do with ex-slaves. So Lincoln was a Republican, but Johnson was more of a Democrat. And back in the day before um, the Electoral College, you saw that the president and the vice president had two different political parties, and so that played out after Lincoln's assassination, and so he proclaimed Reconstruction was essentially done in December 1865. But Congress and specifically the radical Republicans had a different way of thinking about this, and they fought him. So they created some legislation because they had a majority, which the main was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This granted newly emancipated blacks the right to sue, the rights to serve on juries, and several other citizens' rights. Of course, Johnson vetoed this bill, but they had the majority and they was able to override it. They also created the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which made ex-slaves U.S. citizens, and also the 15th Amendment that gave slaves the rights to, or ex-slaves the rights to vote. Now, they also created their own Reconstruction plan that was a little more harsher on the South. So the first Reconstruction Act in 1867 divided it into 5 military districts. So the South was divided into 5 military districts and were ran by military. Um, and the second Reconstruction Act put the military in charge over voter registration. So this helped enfranchise blacks, which give them the right to vote. Um, and this was also just like Lincoln, he did this for political gain. The radical Republicans did it for political gain as well, but because without the blacks being able to vote, they would not have the majority. And they also tried to impeach Andrew Johnson. They created the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which required the president to consult with the House and the Senate before trying to remove any appointed cabinet members from a previous presidency, and so they were trying to protect somebody who was left from Lincoln, but Johnson went ahead and fired him anyway, and so they tried to impeach him on that, but he was acquitted from any charges. And so now, white Southerners were not happy about what was going on. They were not happy that blacks were gaining the rights of U.S. citizens. They were not happy they were able to vote. So they retaliated and tried their best to stop it at all costs. So like I said, Southern whites did everything in their power to limit the rights of all blacks. So let's talk about black codes. Black codes denied the blacks the right to make contracts, to testify against whites, to marry white women, so men could not marry white women and be unemployed, and anything that a U.S. citizen was granted their rights that were granted to them. They created those black codes to keep the blacks in check. That's what basically the black codes were for, to keep all blacks in check. Um, and then you had the Ku Klux Klan. And you see that's a picture right there of them. They were a hatred group, a terrorist group that was used to scare any blacks from coming to the polls and from voting. They scared them. They did everything they could to stop them from voting. And then you have from the north, you have carpetbaggers, who are northerners who moved to the south after the war. So these northerners moved to the south to influence the South ways of thinking. And then you had your scallywags who were white Unionists and Republicans in the South. So white people who shared the ideas of the Union and of Republicans, and who were Republicans, because most whites were Democrats that was in the South at that time. Okay, so that's it for our mini little lesson. That's the beginning of the Reconstruction era, and we will talk about the rest tomorrow. But make sure you complete your timeline with the information that I have discussed from this lesson. So make sure you're filling it in so you can have it for the quiz tomorrow. Because unless you just have a super great memory, you're gonna need it. And don't forget to write down all vocabulary that is highlighted in yellow. So make sure you're keeping track of that on your with your notes as well. Like I said, this is just the beginning of this lesson on Reconstruction, and we will discuss the rest in class after the quiz. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. I hope you guys learned a lot.